Hello, Psychology of Learning students. So this is the second video for chapter 7. We're talking about schedules of reinforcement. Okay, I'm sharing the screen to share the PowerPoint slides with you. Let me get these up and loaded. Okay, great. So in the first video, I talked about the continuous schedule of reinforcement and then 4 of the intermittent schedules of reinforcement: fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. In this video, I'm going to talk about extinction. I'm going to cover some more simple schedules that you probably haven't heard of before, ones that you didn't learn when you were taking general psychology, and then compound schedules. So let's get started. Okay, extinction is the first thing that we want to cover. And you heard about extinction, you probably already know what it is because we talked about extinction with classical conditioning. So in classical conditioning, extinction is when the CS stops being presented with the US, and eventually the CS will no longer lead to the CR. In operant conditioning, the association is between the behavior and the reinforcement. So extinction occurs when the reinforcer does not occur after the behavior over and over and over. So eventually the behavior stops getting emitted very often. So it's when a previously reinforced behavior stops because it's no longer followed by the reinforcement. You can kind of see it's when that association breaks down. So in operant conditioning, this conditioning means when the reinforcer isn't presented after the behavior a bunch of times, then the behavior stops being emitted. So let's use a really concrete example. So let's say I've got my dog, Daisy, and I say, Daisy, sit, and Daisy sits, and I give Daisy a treat. And I work on that with Daisy for a week or so. Now Daisy's really got it. We use continuous reinforcement schedule. She's got it down. I say, Daisy, sit, she sits. I don't give her a treat. I say, Daisy, sit, she sits. I don't give her a treat. I say, Daisy, sit, she sits. I don't give her a treat. Over and over again. See how I've stopped reinforcing the behavior. Well, extinction will occur when she stops sitting when I ask her to do that. But before it goes away, there's going to be what we call an extinction burst. Think about being Daisy. So Daisy, for a whole week, every time I say sit and she sits, she gets a treat. Now she sat there and sat, and I said sit and she sat, and I'm not giving her a treat. And I've done this several times in a row. Well, now she's probably going to get near me and sit, even when I haven't said to sit. She's going to hang around me and sit all the time, get back up and sit down. Almost like, do you not see that I'm doing my part? Where's my treat? Now, that's not how a behavioral psychologist would talk about it, because I'm using cognitive psychology, talking about expectations and things like that. And they're not going to talk about it that way. But it helps me to remember what the behavior looks like. So an extinction burst is when suddenly that dog is sitting, like sort of like, where's my reinforcement? And then when there is no treat over and over again, then the dog just stops sitting when you say, Daisy, sit. And when the dog stops sitting after I say, Daisy, sit, after it had happened for a while, when there was a reinforcer, we now call that extinction. Okay. Now the rates of extinction vary greatly. The extinction actually can take longer than the learning cycles. And it depends upon the number of times that the behavior was reinforced, the effort that the behavior requires, the type and size of the reinforcement. It also depends on the schedule of reinforcement that you used. So later in this video, I'm going to talk about partial reinforcement effect, or the partial reinforcement extinction effect, and how basically, well, we'll go into it then, but the intermittent schedules, they last longer. They take longer to extinguish those behaviors than if you use the continuous reinforcement schedule. Sometimes after a behavior is extinct, or when you're trying to extinguish it by you're no longer giving the reinforcer, and you're going over and over and over of not giving the reinforcer, sometimes the organism will start giving you other behaviors that they were reinforced for. So Daisy might stop sitting, but now she's doing something else that I had reinforced her for earlier in her training. Maybe she starts walking over near the pee pad or peeing on the pee pad, things that I'm no longer, she's giving me other behaviors that used to lead to reinforcers. Your book talks about the porpoise named How. I'm not sure how to pronounce the porpoise's name. I might be mispronouncing it, but received reinforcement for performing behavior. In the absence of the reinforcement, the porpoise would perform all different kinds of behaviors that had been previously taught. And there's the porpoise. Look at her. Where did she go? There she is. Okay. Let's talk about some other simple schedules now. So we've got several here: fixed duration, variable duration, non-contingent reinforcement, fixed time schedule, variable time schedule, progressive ratio schedule. So these are all ones that you haven't learned in your general psychology class. And you're not going to hear about them in any of your other psychology classes either. And the book, I think, does a really good job explaining them, but I'm going to go through them with you nonetheless, just because it's the only class that you're going to get this in. So the first one that I'm going to talk about here is the fixed duration schedule. And with the fixed duration schedule, the behavior must last a certain amount of time in order to get the reinforcer. So it might be like when my son took piano lessons, I would say you have to practice the piano for 30 minutes. This was like when he was in first or second grade. You have to practice the piano for 30 minutes. And when you're done practicing the piano, I'll give you a snack. So the snack was a reinforcer, but he had to be doing the behavior for 30 minutes. Now, see how that's different than fixed interval. Fixed interval would be you have to do the behavior once during that 30-minute time period. And that's different. Piano playing doesn't even make sense in that context. But fixed duration schedule, the behavior has to last a certain amount of time before it's reinforced. And then variable duration is going to be exactly what you think it is. The behavior has to happen for a certain amount of time before it's reinforced, but that time changes, and it's on an average, it's a certain amount of time. So it might be that it's a variable duration schedule. On average, it has to be 30 minutes. So sometimes it gets this reinforcement after 10 minutes. The next time I might give him the reinforcement after 45 minutes. But he knows the reinforcements is going to come on average every 30 minutes. So that's the fixed and variable duration schedules. Now, there are also two non-contingent reinforcement schedules. And these are so bizarre to me. I don't even understand why they work at all. But this is when the organism is given a reinforcement regardless of their behavior. And it doesn't work very well. It doesn't work as well as any of the other schedules. But the fact that it works at all is kind of amazing. So the first non-contingent reinforcement schedule I'm going to talk about is the fixed time schedule. So with this, after a certain set of time, regardless of what the organism does, they get the reinforcement. So it would be like in the Skinner box, the pigeon would get the reinforcement after 30 minutes. And it wouldn't matter whether the pigeon did nothing or if the pigeon turned around in a circle before they did it, it wouldn't matter. After 30 minutes, they get it. Your book talks about how some people believe welfare is given in this way, that after you've waited however long, I think it's every 2 weeks, you get a check, no matter what you do during that time. As long as 2 weeks has gone by, you get your check. Now, other people would argue, no, that's not true, that you have to actually show that you're looking for work. And other people say, well, you don't have to show that you're looking for work. You just have to say that you're looking for work. But even that is a behavior. At least you're saying that. So I think it's best just to not use that as an example in your head, and use as an example in your head something that's more controlled, like in the Skinner box. Okay. Then we've got, of course, the variable time schedule, where you're reinforced after an average amount of time, regardless of behavior. So no matter what you do, after a certain amount of time, the reinforcement comes, but that time's going to change from trial to trial, but on average, be at a certain amount. Okay. All right, then we have another one. We've got this progressive ratio schedule. And this is where the rules change over time. So It's kind of interesting a way to do it, but you let the organism know. So let's say I'm a basketball coach and I want to get my players to be really good at free throws. So what I might say is at the end of practice today, before you can leave, so the reinforcer is that you get to leave practice, before you can leave, you have to get three free throws in the basket. Once you get three, you can go. So the kids stay as long as they have to get their three and they leave. Then the next day they come and I say, today you're going to have to get five before you can leave. So they do their five and then they go. And then the next day they come and I go, you need to get seven before you can do it today. And you can see how as it goes on. So this is called a progressive ratio schedule. So in the first day, they just needed three. The next day, they needed five. And you might do the first week, they need three. And the second week, they need five. And then the third week, they need seven, and so on. Now, at some point in here, like if you're always increasing it, there's going to be a time where now I'm saying you need to have 50 of them before you can leave. And that's just too many. They can't get to 50. Like by the time they get to 50, it's midnight and they're exhausted. So basically, they're going to end up leaving without getting the reinforcer. Now, in this case, I made the leaving the reinforcer. So you have to think of an example where it wouldn't be a good example of a breaking point, but a breaking point is when you've asked too much for them and they can't do it, so they just give up and they stop doing the behavior, knowing that they're not going to get the reinforcer. Okay, so in the example I gave, probably they're going to say, Coach, you got to let me leave. It's 10 o'clock at night. I have to get up for school tomorrow. I've been here for 4 hours. I can't do this. This is beyond my capability. So it'd be the breaking point. Okay. All right. Now, there's a thing that we call thin schedule. And the thin schedule is when people and organisms will perform behaviors, a whole bunch of behaviors, or behaviors for a really long time, for a very small reward. We call it a thin schedule because they're doing so much for so little. It almost doesn't make sense. Like, why are they doing this? And one of the explanations that we have, or one way that you can get a thin schedule, is to use stretching the ratio, or this stretching schedule. And what you do with the stretching schedule, it's exactly what you use shaping. It's great for shaping, is that you keep asking the organism to do more and more for the same reward. It's similar to what I was talking about with the progressive ratio schedule. So here, it might be that first, we'll use Daisy, the dog, as the example, was sitting. Remember at the beginning, I'm going to put her on a continuous reinforcement schedule. So I say, Daisy, sit, and she sits and she gets reinforcement right away. Daisy, sit, and she gets reinforcement right away. And I might do that for a whole week. But then the second week, she needs to do it 3 times before I reinforce her. Now, I'm not going to tell her about this. It's not something we agreed upon. It's not something that we said, oh, we're going to keep increasing it each time so you'll get better and better. I just do it. And so now I say, Daisy, sit, and she sits. I don't give her a treat. Daisy, sit, and she sits. I don't give her a treat. Daisy, sit, and she sits. That's her 3rd time. She gets the reinforcer. She gets the treat. So for this second week, it's this fixed ratio 3, where every 3rd time she sits, she gets the treat. Then the next week, it ups to 5, where she has to do it 5 times before she gets the treat. And then the next week, let's say it goes up to 12. And you could see how this could go on. And eventually you're looking at this dog and you're going, this dog has sat for you 100 times before you gave him the treat. Why is this dog doing so much for such a small reward for one little tiny treat? How did you get them on such a thin schedule? And it's because you use this stretching the ratio design. Now, some of you might go, well, why would you want to do this? Well, this is what, if you're in therapy or you're a therapist and you're trying to use reinforcement to increase your client's behavior, and your client wants to increase some positive behavior, well, you want them to be able to keep this behavior going on even when they stop going to therapy, or even when they're going to therapy a lot less often. So you're going to want to put them on a thin schedule. You're going to want to do this stretching the ratio. So you'll end up with a nice thin schedule. They'll be doing a lot for very little reinforcers. Okay, you have to be careful when you do the stretching the ratio though. If you do it you ask too much too soon, you'll break the whole thing down, it won't work, and we call that ratio strain. So if you add too much too soon, it won't work, and you'll end up with ratio strain. Okay, so now let's talk about compound schedules. So all of the schedules we've talked about so far are what we call simple schedules. So, but now with compound schedules, we're going to combine in different ways these simple schedules. And there's a whole bunch of these, but your book talks about 6. These are the 6 that your book talks about. So these are the 6 that I'm going to talk about. So the first one is the multiple compound schedule. And with this, you're going to take 2 or more simple schedules, but each simple schedule, and you can go back and forth between them, but there'll be some signal that lets the organism know that things are changing. So in the Skinner box with the pigeons, it might be that when a red light goes on, you're using a FR5 schedule. But when a yellow light is on, then they're going to be reinforced on a VI3 schedule. So the organism gets some warning on which one is going to be used, or there's some association of which one is going to be used, so they can alter their behavior accordingly. Okay, so that's your multiple compound schedule. The mixed compound schedule is just like the multiple, but the organism's given no signal. So there is no red light to signal that it's going to be FR5 and then a yellow light to signal that it's changed to VI3. It just begins at FR5 and then all of a sudden it changes to VI3 and then it might go back to FR5 and then back to VI3, and the organism gets no warning. They just have to figure it out on their own. So that's a mixed compound schedule. Then we have chain compound schedules. So with chain compound schedules, you get another reinforcement when you finish the chain. So it might be you have to do the FR5 followed by the VI3, and then you're going to get the reinforcer. Okay, that's with the chain. With the chain, though, you're going to get a signal, just like you do in the multiple one. So the red light might come on when you're doing the FR5, and then the yellow light comes on, and now you have to do the VI3, and after you've completed both of those, you get reinforced. With the next one, what we call tandem, you are going to have to complete 2 of the simple ones, and it could even be more. So you might have to do the FR5 and then followed by the VI3, but no signal to let you know it's changed. So you have to complete both of these in sequence, but if they change in the middle and you're not given any warning why, you just have to figure it out. Now, all 4 of these that we've talked about are done individually. So they're done on one pigeon or one rat or one human being or one thing. Sometimes you can get these compound schedules where you're doing it with groups. So the cooperative compound schedule says that a group of people or a group of rats or a group of pigeons all have to do a total behavior in order for the reinforcement to occur. So it might be that everyone's on an FR5 schedule, and until everyone makes their 5 responses, their 5 behaviors, then no one gets the reinforcer. And everyone will get the reinforcement once they all do it. So that's going to be your cooperative. And then the concurrent, now this is interesting. This is when the individual gets to pick their schedule of reinforcement. So you might be a pigeon, and on one side, there's a lever that you, on the left side, let's say, there's a lever that you have to press, and it's operating in an FR5 schedule. But to the right, there's another lever, and if you press that, well, I guess with pigeons, it's not levers, it's X, but you get the point. Over here on this side, it's operating on a VI3 schedule. And the pigeon gets to decide which one am I going to go to. And the pigeon can even go to one and press and peck at the lever over here, then go over to the pet and peck the lever over there and back and forth. What Skinner found is that most animals, I mean, the pigeons, the rats, they got really good with a concurrent compound schedule. They got really good at figuring out which one they could get the most from. So if you had to the right a fixed ratio schedule of 5, and on the other side, fixed ratio schedule of 20, they spent all their time over here on the fixed ratio of 5 because they could get the same reinforcer for just doing 5 movements, 5 pecks, rather than being over here with 20. But if you've got a fixed interval schedule on one of these, they can run over to one side, do the behavior at the fixed interval. They know they have a little bit of time, they can run over to the other side and do a fixed ratio, and then run back over here and get their reinforcement and do it one more time. And they come up with these really great optimal ways where they can get the most reinforcement for the least number of behaviors. So that concurrent compound schedule, it's amazing how good animals are at figuring it out. So there's one more thing. This is what I was talking about earlier that I said I'd talk about at the end of the presentation. And this is the partial reinforcement effect. Sometimes in some books, it's called the partial reinforcement extinction effect. And this is the phenomenon, the finding that behaviors that are reinforced on an intermittent, in other words, not the continuous reinforcement schedule, on any of those intermittent schedules, it takes them longer to get to be extinguished. They're less prone to extinction. And this has a lot of practical applications. When we were talking about my trying to train Daisy, then rather than training Daisy to sit on a continuous reinforcement schedule, she'll learn it the quickest that way, but I'm going to have to keep giving her treats all the time or we'll get extinguished. It might be better to put her on a variable ratio schedule and maybe I do a VR10 where she has to sit on average 10 times before she gets a treat. Once I train her to do that, I don't have to give her that many treats to get her sitting quite often when I ask her to sit. Now, some people or your book has asked, okay, how does this work? Why does this happen? And one explanation that's very popular is the frustration hypothesis. And it says that when you are trained on an intermittent schedule, then there have been times when you have sat, if your days where you've sat and not gotten your reinforcer, and you might be frustrated. But that frustration, you're used to that because then the next time you're asked to sit and you sit, you might get the reinforcer. And so getting frustrated and still doing the behavior and still getting reinforced isn't new to you. So when the behavior is getting extinguished and you're not given the reinforcer, that frustration isn't an inhibitor to you, like it would be to someone who learned it on a continuous reinforcement schedule. Another explanation is the discrimination hypothesis that says it's harder to, and it says that it's harder for the organism to distinguish that this is an extinction trial versus a learning trial with the intermittent schedule than the continuous reinforcement schedule. So on the continuous reinforcement, every time you do the behavior, you get the response, you get the reinforcement. So when you do the behavior 3 or 4 or 10 times and no reinforcement has come, you're like, I'm out of here. But if you're on, let's say, a variable ratio schedule that's 10 times, that's 10. Well, there have been times where you did the behavior 20 times before you got reinforced. So you can see how now you're going to need to go way more than 20 before you're going to even be able to distinguish, oh, this isn't working the way it used to work. I thought I was just on a super long average thing, but this isn't working the way that it is, but it takes longer to distinguish it. And so that's why why extinction might take longer with the intermittent schedule. Another explanation is the sequential hypothesis. that says that it has to do with a difference in the sequencing of cues during training, because there's the cues in like a variable ratio schedule is different than in the continuous ratio schedule. And then the last one that I kind of like, I mean, I like all of them, but is the response unit hypothesis. And what this says is that if you redefine extinction, not by how many behaviors does the organism do before they quit, after the reinforcer's not there, but if instead you look at how many units of reinforcement were done, then extinction lasts about the same amount of time. So if you think of on a continuous, I'm just going to make something up. You think on a continuous reinforcement schedule, the organism does the behavior, gets reinforced. They have to do the behavior maybe 10, we'll just say 10 times without getting reinforced before they stop doing the behavior. So we say extinction happens in 10 times. If they're in a fixed ratio 10 times, 10 schedule, then they did it 10 times and got reinforced, 10 times and got reinforced. That was the learning. Now, when it comes to extinction, it might take 100 times before it's extinguished. So someone looking at that says on the continuous reinforcement schedule, it only took 10 times, but on this fixed ratio 10 scale, it took, or intermittent schedule, it took 100 times before it was extinguished. Look, this one's much longer. But if you redefine this one into reinforcement units, the unit was that it took 10 times before they got reinforced. So there's been 10 units. It was 100 behaviors, but 10 units before extinction went away. And when you look at it that way, extinction seems to take about the same amount of time. So we've been talking about these partial reinforcers and extinction using like getting Daisy to sit. And I think it's easy to think about them with positive behaviors. I want you to remember that sometimes we unintentionally put people on intermittent schedules of reinforcement, which makes it really hard to extinguish the behavior. So I'm going to use the example, I think I used it last week, of taking my daughter to the mall because I need to get a birthday present or something for someone after we've both had a long day and I'm really tired. And she goes, I want a baby doll, I want a baby doll, or I want a toy, I want a toy, I want a toy. And I'm just too tired to deal with it. And I go in, there used to be a toy store in the mall, go in and get her the toy. Now, if the next time I take her shopping and she goes, I want a toy, I want a toy, I want a toy. I'm like, Patricia, no, we're not getting a toy. You haven't earned enough points in whatever we were doing at the time, reading or whatever she had to do to earn points to have enough for a toy. Nope, you don't have enough points for a toy. You can't get a toy. Then another time I'm not tired, we go to the mall. I want a toy, I want a toy. Nope, you don't have enough points. So we're doing okay. I'm back on track, being the good mom. Maybe 10 times I'm a good mom. So it's been months now because I don't go to the mall that often. But then we go to the mall and I'm exhausted again. And she goes, I want a toy, I want a toy. And I'm just like, oh, fine. And I buy her a toy. I just put her on a variable ratio schedule. She has learned if I ask enough times, I'll get the toy. But that amount that I'm going to have to ask is going to keep changing. And so I have just bought myself probably another year of her asking for toys when we go shopping before this behavior is going to extinguish. So sometimes we inadvertently put our kids or family members and ourselves on intermittent schedules of reinforcement that make extinction really difficult or long, okay? All right, well, we have covered all of the material from chapter 7. Next week, we'll do chapter 8, and then the following week, we'll be ready for our exam too. So email me if you have any questions at all, maryd@cameron.edu.